Hi. I'm recording this on Good Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. I'm at my in-laws, my brother-in-law's house, and I found a little tent of solitude where I've taken refuge for a few minutes. And as I've spent these few minutes, along with my friend here, contemplating the deepest matters in the universe, I've been contemplating memes. Specifically, the meme that's been making the round in at least the D&D memes subreddit concerning invisibility and See Invisibility. It seems that there's something strange has been going on in the interactions between these two effects, let's call them. So first of all, according to the Player's Handbook, 5th edition, invisibility does not one, but two things. One, it makes you invisible, hence invisibility. The second one is that you get disadvantage, or folks targeting you get disadvantage on you. One would imagine that this is because you are invisible. They can't see you, hence they have a hard time targeting you. But, apparently, according to Jeremy Crawford at least, rules as written, this is actually not the case. And how this came up is because I suppose someone must have been reading with a magnifying glass, going over with a fine-tooth comb of the PHB, and decided or thought that maybe these things weren't as connected as they might seem to someone just reading it for the first time or reading it in some kind of normal way. The fact that the disadvantage that people get targeting invisible creatures isn't actually coupled tightly with the fact that you're invisible. Now, I don't know how this came up, how someone read this. I'm assuming either some DM who was trying to be clever or some player who was trying to be clever looked at it and thought, they haven't really connected these two elements of the effects of being invisible together. One is you're invisible, and two is you have a status of being invisible, a state, an effect, a tag, whatever you want to call it, that is invisible. And that invisible tag is what is associated with the disadvantage to being targeted. On to See Invisibility. See Invisibility allows you to see invisible creatures. Makes sense. It might also make sense that since you can see something that was or is invisible, that the effects of that invisibility no longer apply to you. In other words, if the creature who has the state, effect, tag of invisibility is targeted by someone who can see invisible things, then that invisibility state would not apply to them, right? You can see the invisible thing, thus you can affect that invisible thing without penalty. But apparently this is not the case. Per Jeremy Crawford, per his sage advice column, and I suppose a careful reading of the PHB, which didn't connect all the dots, apparently being able to see invisible actually does not negate the invisible effect. Thus, someone who is seeing an invisible creature is still disadvantaged when trying to affect that invisible creature because while it lets you see them, it does not negate or otherwise disrupt that state of being invisible. Does this make sense? Not particularly, at least not to me. I think that most folks in the D&D memes community have been making fun of this and have brought up all kinds of other weirdness which would happen if you had to treat the PHB that if you don't literally connect two dots together, then they are separate. People have been joking about things like, well, then they never say you breathe air, so what do you breathe? Or they never say you have lungs, so therefore you might not have lungs. All this kind of goofiness has arisen out of this meme. Now, I don't have anything particular to say about this, other than it just strikes me as another one of this just kind of wacky ways in which it's not even really the rules of 5th edition, because I think anybody logically reading it, I think most tables playing with common sense would say that, hey, you can see an invisible creature, they lose the state of being invisible to you, thus you can target them. Like, I don't think there are many tables who are debating this or that this was a problem with, but it's very interesting that, one, this question came up at all, that somebody thought to try to connect the dots or thought, there's a gap in here to exploit, I guess. I don't know how else this would come up. And I don't know in any other community that I can think of other than the 5th edition community when this would even be a thing, where even someone would even be questioning the fact of how See Invisible actually technically relates to the state of invisibility. I don't know that this would happen anywhere else. And then, of course, it's compounded by the fact that Jeremy Crawford has said, yes, You're right. In fact, this is as intended that just because you see an invisible creature doesn't mean that you can actually get lose that disadvantage to strike or hit or otherwise interact with that invisible creature, which of course left I think just about everybody going, huh? And of course, there's a lot of the responses of, well, Jeremy Crawford, though he's the co-author and blah 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 and head of all this D&D stuff over Wizards, doesn't know what he's talking about. And look, this seems on its face kind of a nonsensical solution to this. Some folks have argued he's just doubling down because they don't want to admit an error. I don't know. I don't want to know what's inside the mind of someone who is spouting this sort of madness. I think someone pointed that Jeremy Crawford might have been referring to invisibility almost like a predator-like effect. So when the predator is moving, even if you see the predator, it doesn't necessarily help you that much. Sure, it narrows down the general area where the predator is, but the predator is still kind of shifty, hard to hit. That might be okay, but I think I could say with some amount of confidence that that's not the type of invisibility that folks have envisioned since the dawn of D&D up to the present in terms of how invisibility works. In a different game, in a different setting where we had established that, hey, invisibility is this sort of predator-like effect. Even if you can see the invisible person, it's not a complete seeing. It's more like a sort of a loose outline or something of that nature. Maybe this would make more sense. I don't know what to do with it. A while back, I posted about there being this thing about being able to shove gelatinous cubes, even though the whole point of a gelatinous cube, its entire mode of attack is basically to try to touch and envelop you, and yet this concept that you could push and shove it back. I thought, does this say something about the 5th edition and the way that things work, kind of mechanics over fiction? And I would say again, this is so in a way a follow-up to that in terms of, is this how we're saying we have to interpret the rules in 5th edition or modern D&D, that if they don't literally put a line between two things, we can't assume that that's true, that the kind of common sense idea of something's invisible so you can't see it, but now you can see invisibility so you can see it, no longer really applies unless they literally tell you in the writing, yes, this will negate this effect, that you're not meant to make the kind of leap that, oh, see invisible negates the advantages of being invisible. Doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't seem to make sense to anybody else that I've seen. I haven't noticed anyone actually trying to defend Jeremy Crawford's take on this. It seems fairly indefensible from anything other than I don't know, technical rules as sort of legal documentation, is there a loophole kind of way. But maybe that's where these things are going. Obviously, this is kind of the way Wizards writes a lot of their rulings now, and I think some of that's for good reason, because where did this whole hubbub come from? Somebody had to ask about it, which meant somebody was looking for a loophole and either found it or found that they were wrong. I'm not sure. It's certainly something I appreciate about other systems, including the OSR, NSR, and other ones that basically just say, hey, common sense says that if you're invisible, you get certain advantages, and then if somebody can see through your invisibility, you lose those advantages. Now, of course, D&D at large has probably been playing with this since day one. It's probably going to continue to play with this, but it's just interesting that this kind of concept, this sort of conflict came up in the first place, and maybe even more interesting to how at least the folks from WotC have seen to deliberate and hand down a ruling on that. Enjoy your Black Friday, and if it's not your Black Friday, well, just enjoy your Friday. Enjoy any day you end up watching or listening to this. Game on. I'll talk to you later.